Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to show you how I installed this 0 fret onto this guitar. However, before I do that, for those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, go back and watch episode 140, and I'll put a link in the description below. And that'll kind of give you an idea of what 0 fret is and give you some information about whether or not it's something you would want to consider for one of your guitars. And then once you've digested that video, you can come back and rejoin us right about now. Okay, so before I jump into showing you how I installed the 0 fret, I should explain a few things first. And first of all, the 0 fret that I installed was specifically made for this purpose. And it was supplied to me by a company called Sintoms, which is located in Eastern Europe. But don't worry, their products are widely available everywhere. You can, in fact, I noticed they're available on Amazon. So I don't know for sure if this specific product is available yet. They sent this to me early on, and I haven't really seen it anywhere. But if you go to their website, and I'll put a link again in the description below, you can probably contact them via email and say, hey, you know, Chris at Highline Guitars did a video on installing your asymmetrical 0 fret. Where can I get one? And I'm sure they'll hook you up somehow. So another thing that I wanted to mention was before I installed it on this guitar, I did kind of a test run, and I did it on this acoustic. Now, the thing is, this fret wire wasn't really designed to work with this specific fret wire that's on this acoustic. It was designed to work specifically with the fret wire that's on this guitar. However, I wanted to give it a try anyways, and as it turned out, it worked out pretty well. But the way I installed it, since this guitar is an existing instrument that already has a nut on it, what I had to do was place the asymmetrical fret wire right up against the face of the nut. Now, when I say asymmetrical, the highest part of the crown is right up against the edge, which is placed up against the face of the nut. The idea behind that is you're not going to be shifting the 0 position, but in truth, you are shifting it. But in this case, you're only shifting it about 0.02 inches, which is just slightly more than a 64th of an inch. So it may not be enough to really matter. Anyway, on the back side of the fret wire, or on the bottom of it, instead of a tang, there's a very slight ridge that runs the length of the fret wire. So when I placed the fret wire right up against the nut, of course the strings were taken off, all I had to do was slide it back and forth, applying some downward pressure. And what that did was that little ridge on the back put a mark. It scored just a very slight mark in front of the nut. Then I took a tiny flat-bladed precision screwdriver, and I placed it against the nut so that the corner of that flat blade was resting right on that mark. And then I just scored it a couple of times, and that made a mark deep enough for the little ridge on the back of the fret wire to pop down into. And then I just cut it to length, glued it into position, restrung the guitar, tuned it, and intonated. And I was surprised it works quite well. Now the action is a little bit high because, like I said, this particular 0 fret wasn't really designed to work with this fret wire. But I was encouraged enough to go ahead and install it on this guitar. But in this case, what I did was I actually engineered this fretboard to work with this 0 fret concept. And what I did was I shifted my nut a little bit closer to the tuners by about a 64th of an inch so that the highest part of the 0 fret will be right exactly on the 0 position. And what I did then was when I cut this fretboard on my CNC machine was I cut the slot for the string guide nut, and then I cut a very slight shallow slot for the tiny little ridge on the 0 fret. However, because this is wood, um, that tiny little shallow slot ended up blending in with the larger nut slot. And so what I ended up with was the nut slot with a slight shelf for my 0 fret. And it's actually a little bit bigger than probably it needs to be, but I found in the end it worked to my advantage. And later on in this video, I think you'll see what I mean when I'm installing all this. So without further ado, let's jump into how I installed this 0 fret. The first thing I had to do was cut off old Bessie's leg so I could use the bone for a string guide nut. Then I cut out a chunk of her femur and sanded it down until I had a blank that was slightly oversized for what I would eventually need. And this is what that rough blank looked like after I was finished sanding it. Next, I had to sand the thickness of the blank so that it would fit snug into the slot that I had cut into the fretboard with my CNC machine. The fit is snug but not too tight because I wouldn't want to crack the fretboard. To mark the contour of the top of the nut, I have a pencil which I ground in half on my belt sander, and I just lay it on top of the frets and then draw a line across the top of the nut. Then I mark the sides so I know how wide to make it. Then it was back to the disc sander to begin rough shaping the nut. I'm not going to take it down to its final size yet. I'll do that later on as I work through different grits of sandpaper because I don't want to overdo it at this point. I also took this opportunity to fine-tune the shelf that the 0 fret is going to be resting on. And then it was a matter of doing some minor final sanding in order to get the nut to the right shape so that it would fit in the slot. And at this point, I'm just sanding with 400 grit sandpaper to remove as many of the scratches as possible. I don't have the tuners on this guitar yet or the bridge, so I had to use a StewMax string spacing ruler to mark the position of the strings. Cutting the slots is similar to how you would slot a regular guitar nut. I'll start with a 10 gauge nut slotting file and just kind of mark the very start of those slots. And then I'll work my way up through progressively larger files. But what I'm going to do in this case is I'm going to cut the slots to be more of a V shape, and that'll allow me to use any gauge of string that I want on this guitar without having to modify the slots later on. It takes some patience and a little bit of experience to know how to progress with this process. To shape the slots like a V, I use different microfiles to create that profile in each slot. Rolling a nut slotting file over from side to side helps to refine that V-shaped profile in each slot. And I carved each slot to a depth just slightly below the line that I had indicated with my half of a pencil. That means that when I string up the guitar after installing the 0 nut, the string should rise up over and rest on top of the 0 fret with a little bit of space underneath the string to the bottom of the nut slot. And this is how they should look after cutting the V slots. And just to make sure I had the slots deep enough, I used a feeler gauge in each slot to make sure that when it's placed into the slot, it's sitting directly on top and in contact with the 0 fret. At this point, I could go ahead and do the finish sanding, which I did up to about 800 grit. Then I took it to my buffing machine, and this is how it looks after putting a little bit of a shine on it. Now I could apply a bead of thick CA glue to the slot to install the nut. I like to use thick CA glue because it has good working time. Now remember earlier in the video when I said that cutting that shelf would pay off in the end? Well, this is where that happened. When I had applied that thick CA glue to the slot and then pressed the nut into the slot, the squeeze out actually filled the shelf. So I could spread it out with a toothpick, and since it has a longer working time, I could then prepare the 0 fret to be installed using the glue that had squeezed out when installing the nut. Obviously, I want the radius of my 0 fret to match the radius of the fretboard, so I ran it through my fret wire radiusing tool. While that CA glue is still wet, I had to work quickly to cut the 0 fret to the proper width. And then I filed and sanded the end smooth. And believe it or not, that thick CA glue is still wet even after about 15 minutes. So all I had to do was set the 0 fret down on the fretboard and slide it toward the nut until I felt that tiny ridge snap into the shelf that I had cut in front of the nut. And since I don't have the tuners installed yet, I can't use the strings to apply downward force and press that 0 fret flat against the fretboard. So I just used a pair of squeeze clamps. Okay guys, well that's pretty much all it takes to install a Sintoms stainless steel asymmetrical 0 fret on a brand new guitar project. And you kind of got an idea of what it takes to retrofit an existing guitar, which I think is a lot easier to do. And I probably made it seem a lot harder than it actually is because I actually fabricated the nut, which is most of what you saw. The actual installation of the 0 fret is just a matter of popping it into the scored groove in front of the nut with a little bit of CA glue. And it's pretty simple to do, really. So unfortunately, I have run out of time. It's already Friday, and I need to get this video edited and posted. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to string up this guitar, tune it, intonate it, and play some notes. But I promise I will do that next week. And I should have this guitar pretty close to being completely finished by then. But the least I can do is string it up, intonate it, and we'll see how well this 0 fret performs. But by all accounts, I am very confident that this Sintoms 0 fret concept is going to work really well. So, like I said, if you're interested in checking them out, hit their website and maybe shoot them an email and see, if they can hook you up with one of these things. And down the road, maybe we can compare notes and see what everybody thinks of this product. So until next week, when I play this guitar, I hope you have a fantastic weekend, a great week ahead, and we will see you soon.